All right, let's get started. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Greta Zaro. I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War. World Beyond War is a global grassroots network of activists and allied organizations in 189 countries worldwide that are advocating for the abolition of the institution of war and its replacement with a just and sustainable peace. And today's event is a discussion of the man who saved the world, and we'll also be talking about the historic day coming up on January 22nd, when the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes into force. So in terms of the agenda for today, first we will hear from Alice Slater, who is a board member of World Beyond War, and she holds many titles, including being the UN NGO Representative for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. She has worked on nuclear abolition issues for her entire life, and so she will help paint a picture of the nuclear abolition movement and kind of how we got where we are today with the nuclear ban treaty. After Alice talks, then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion with Alice. So do put your questions into the chat as Alice is speaking, and then we'll read off those questions. Then after that, we will go into breakout rooms, and we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion, and those breakout rooms will be moderated by World Beyond War chapter coordinators and staff members from around the world. And based on the registration feedback, the breakout rooms will be a random mix of people internationally. And then after breakout rooms, we'll have some time for report backs, and then we'll close with some action steps and next steps to take action on this issue. So Alice, take it away.
Thanks, Greta, and welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to see you all today, or be in the Zoom with you. I was just reading the paper today that Russia is pulling out of an open skies treaty that we had since 1972 with the Soviet Union. Trump pulled out of it in May, and he was trying to figure out how we could keep the US here, and nobody was, answering him or helping him to keep it going. So now he says he's pulling out, but I also think that they're waiting to see what Biden will do. And we are now at a very perilous crossroads with nuclear weapons. I mean, we've had, Trump has pulled out of a lot of treaties. We had the Intermediate Nuclear Forces that was negotiated in the 80s. I mean, he walked out of the Iran agreement that Russia helped to negotiate, actually. And we're just, he was talking about doing nuclear testing again, even though we signed a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1992. So we're on the precipice here, and I hope that with the new government, they'll make the right decisions moving forward for nuclear disarmament, because we have at the same time this very exciting trend where we got the whole world to say nuclear weapons should be banned and be illegal, and that treaty takes effect this month. There's going to be all kinds of celebrations. So I'll try to give you the big picture there of about 14,000 nuclear weapons on the planet today, and 13,000 of them are in the US and Russia, of which we each have 2,500 nuclear weapons pointed at each other on hair trigger alert. And I hope you will watch this wonderful film with a man who saved the world, which is the reason for us getting together, because he actually disobeyed orders and waited, and there was a computer glitch. Otherwise, he had orders to fire on every American city. I mean, it's extraordinary what he did, I was honored to be at the UN when they honored him. I'm actually in the film sitting in the audience, but it was just like so fabulous that somebody took that kind of action out of his own conscience. I thought the movie was very touching. I mean, we'll probably discuss it later, groups, but we're on missile silo, guys. What are they saying? They're in the silos also, waiting to shoot back, and there have been so many near misses. So of these 13,000, the US and Russia, the other 1,000 nuclear weapons are in 7 other countries: England, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. They are the other 7 nuclear states. 5 of them signed a treaty in 1970, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that was Russia, US, China, England, and France, promising to give up on nuclear weapons if the rest of the world promised not to get them. That's the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And everybody signed this treaty except in India, Pakistan, and Israel, and they got them. And the treaty had this Faustian bargain where it promised every country, if you sign the treaty and promise not to get nuclear weapons, we'll give you the keys to the bomb factory. We'll give you an inalienable right to peaceful nuclear power. I mean, just think of that language that comes from our Bill of Rights, inalienable right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and peaceful nuclear power. How did that get in there? So North Korea got their peaceful nuclear power and they walked out and made a bomb. And we were afraid, because that's the hardest part of making a bomb, is enriching the uranium to get the bomb grade nuclear material. And you can't hide that in a laboratory. You need a huge reactor, like a nuclear reactor, to make this happen. So we were afraid Iran was doing it, and that's what that Iran deal was, that they promised not to enrich their uranium, because the product of nuclear power is nuclear waste that can be put through an enrichment machine and made bomb grade. So Iran promised not to enrich beyond a certain level. Now, just to tell you how hypocritical the Western white colonial patriarchy is, Japan enriches their uranium, Brazil enriches their uranium, South Africa, nobody said, don't you do it. We only said, Iran, you can't do it. And we had inspectors. We have the International Atomic Energy Agency that inspects to see if they're going beyond their capacity. They never broke the capacity, Iran. But we still, put them in that Muslim category. That's really something we're going to have to deal with in the world. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1970, where we promised to make, quote, good faith efforts for nuclear disarmament instead of nuclear disarmament, we just kept building new weapons, new technology. And in 1995, when the treaty was 25 years old, the whole world came together. It was going to expire, and they had to decide whether to renew it. And the US and the nuclear weapon states lobbied the whole country to renew it indefinitely, unconditionally, with very few promises. The only promise they made on the renewal was to have a 5-year conference every year and review. And because Egypt refused to sign and they needed consensus, they agreed to hold a conference for a Middle East nuclear weapons, Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, because Israel has the bomb, and nobody is accused. They don't admit it, and we don't accuse them on it, but Egypt knows about it. So they wanted to get their Middle East zone nuclear free, and all we did was agree to talk about it. And that conference never got held. The US always killed it every time they tried to do it. This is from 1995. And at the last review conference, at the 2015 review conference, maybe, South Africa said, this is terrible. There's no progress. Obama made a deal with Medvedev. They cut another 1,200 nuclear weapons out of the 16,000 at the time. We had started with 70,000. So now we're down to a mere 13,000. Anyway, South Africa was so annoyed at the lack of progress at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference. They said this is like nuclear apartheid. The nuclear weapon states are holding the rest of the world hostage to their nuclear bombs. And it kicked off or supported this campaign that had started, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. It was about 5 years old by that time. And we had other meetings, and the Pope acknowledged that nuclear weapons can never be used. even the church used to support our position, like deterrence is okay. It's all right to have them and use them if somebody else threatens, you can use them. So this new treaty, the ban treaty that got adopted in 2017, said, no, they're illegal. You can't use them. You can't threaten to use them. You can't make them. You can't share them. And it got adopted. 122 countries voted for it. None of the nuclear weapon states. And the NATO alliance that's under our nuclear umbrella, plus 3 Pacific countries, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, that are under the US nuclear umbrella that we're willing to use our nukes on their behalf, they all boycotted the meeting. Although it was very interesting, they had a vote at the General Assembly whether or not these negotiations should go forward in 2016. They voted. And the Western nuclear states voted no. US, France, Russia, and Israel voted no. India, Pakistan, and China abstained. And guess what? I'm sure you didn't read this on the front page of the New York Times. North Korea voted yes to ban the bomb. And they're waving their 20 nuclear weapons around because they want us to talk to them. We have troops there since 1953. I mean, we've been sanctioned. People think sanctions are kind and sweet. They're not. People are starving. They're not getting medicine. The sanctions are very harsh on countries, and they want us to stop. They want a peace. We still have a ceasefire since 1953 with 38,000 nuclear American troops on their border. And South Korea elected somebody, like if we had done Jeremy, what's the guy in England? Jeremy, the good guy, the green guy. Right, or Dennis Kucinich in America. South Korea elected a real peace president. And that's why Trump, the broken clock who could be right sometimes, was able to start this negotiation. And he did make a deal with North Korea that we pull 10,000 of our 38,000 troops out. And guess what? All the Democrats and all the Republicans voted against that. They always agree on that in America. So we couldn't do Trump's deal with South Korea, whatever it was, North Korea. Anyway, so the treaty got adopted. It got negotiated. 122 countries voted for it. We won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'll just tell you a personal story. Like my daughter lives in Los Angeles. I live in New York, and she was staying with me in New York for some reason. And the phone rings 5:30 in the morning, and the head of the campaign, Tillman Ruff, who was from the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, he was chair of this campaign that got the ban treaty through. And he and his wife stayed with me in New York when we were negotiating the treaty at the UN. He calls me 5:30 in the morning, Alice, we won the Nobel Peace Prize. So I start screaming, and my daughter wakes up, Ma, why are you screaming? Who's calling so early? I said, we won the Nobel Peace Prize. So she says, you have to go. I said, no, I'm too old. It's too cold. It's winter. And no, I'll go with you. So my daughter went with me, and we saw the king and the queen walking down, and the prize was accepted by 3 women, 2 women. The woman that gave it, the Nobel head of the committee, was a woman, and the women that accepted it was the executive director, Beatrice Finn, who's in her 30s. She's from Sweden, and she's the executive director of the campaign. She had a child while this whole campaign was going. And Setsuko Thurlow, 82, Canadian survivor of Hiroshima when she was a teenager. She immigrated to Canada and, got educated, married a Canadian, and she was speaking at all our meetings. She was so articulate. So these 2 women accepted the Nobel Peace. It was great. It was like a good time for the girls, Anyway. So here we are, and it enters into force. That's one of the requirements of this treaty, which says you can't make them, you can't have them, you can't share them, you can't threaten to use them or use them. It needed 50 countries to ratify the treaty. It was already signed by 84. so far. But ratification is a deeper process. Like in America, to ratify a treaty, the Senate has to vote by 2/3, and every country has rules of involving their parliaments in ratification. So it just got ratified, and then 90 days from the date of ratification, it enters into force. That's the legal term, and that is on January 22nd, that nuclear weapons will be illegal. There's no good faith efforts. They're banned. And everybody says, well, what are you going to do if the nuclear weapon states? And let me tell you something. When they banned the landmines, the US never joined the treaty. They never signed it. We don't make them anymore. We don't use them anymore. They've become so stigmatized and taboo. And the US keeps nuclear weapons in 5 NATO countries. Germany, Italy, Belgium, Turkey, and Holland. And there's all kinds of activity going on in those Western NATO states to get the nukes out now that they're illegal. So it's putting pressure on the issue. And we have a huge international divestment campaign, Don't Bank on the Bomb. And I'm sure all these links will be up for all of you to see. And Norway's national pensions went out of any companies that make nuclear weapons. So I think I can end there. I think I've given you the picture. This is where we are today. And let's all do something on the 22nd. Actually, this is part of that, beginning the celebration to the 22nd, this event with this wonderful Colonel Petrov, who really, imagine taking a stand like he did. So thank you very much, all of you, to be here, and onward and upward.
On behalf of all of us, I'll just say thank you so much, Alice, for sharing. I know you have much more you could have said, but for giving us this overview from a global perspective, from a personal perspective, as someone who has really dedicated her life to abolishing nuclear weapons. I am excited for us to take some questions from the audience. Please type them in the chat and then we'll read them from there, just to avoid any technical issues with people's microphones. One question I see is, do all nuclear armed countries have protocols so that launching a weapon can be decided by one person? Can you answer that question, Alice, as the first one?
Could you repeat it? I'm sorry, I was tell me again what you said.
Absolutely. Do all nuclear armed countries currently have protocols so that launching a weapon can actually be decided by just one person?
I'm not familiar with everybody's protocols, but I do know that China is the only country that has always maintained we will never be the first to use them, and that they keep their bombs separate from their missiles. This is a big deal. They're, Russia, most of them have them on missiles loaded, ready to go, but I'm really not familiar with everybody's protocol. I'm sure the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, or, we could get some research on that.
I imagine it's not all public information as well. I have a question for you. I'm wondering if you can tell us about when you first heard that nuclear weapons had been detonated, when you first heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how you have seen ideas about the use of those weapons change over time.
Well, I was 7 years old in 1945, and it was a summer, and I grew up in the Bronx in New York City, so we rented a bungalow in the Catskills to get out of the heat because we didn't have air conditioning. And on Saturday, if it was raining, we'd go to the movies, and they had the movie tone news. We had no television then. And they had the news, and they showed the picture in August 1945 of the mushroom cloud and the nuclear explosion. And I was 7 years old, sitting there with my mother, and I said, "What is that?" And she says to me, "This is a wonderful new weapon, and now all the boys will come home." And that was how we were told about it. And it took years to find out there were so many cover-ups in Japan. I mean, if you talk to Japanese people, it wasn't just that the bomb killed 140,000 people. It was that there was radiation poisoning for years. They're still suffering from it, you know. And they covered up all the data and the statistics. And this is interesting about nuclear power because they've tried to separate it. We started doing this nuclear testing in the Pacific, the Marshall Islands. I mean, we were blowing up hydrogen bombs, which the atom bomb was the trigger for the hydrogen bomb. It was magnitudes greater. And there was this Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, that got hurt. And the Japanese who we were occupying got very angry at us that we were hurting them more with nuclear stuff. And Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, started the Atoms for Peace program. That was his military and CIA, his intelligence. Let's do Atoms for Peace. And they sold it as a wonderful piece. And the first country to do it was Japan. They gave it to them for nothing, nuclear power. And they had this former war crimes guy that was doing the PR about the peaceful use of the atom to brainwash them that there's something good about it. That's, of course, we started to hear the whole story about it. You know, you asked me, what did we learn over the years? You know, I wasn't an anti-nuclear activist. I started out with the Vietnam War, but then when my kids were grown, I went to law school and I saw a thing in the Law Journal. They were having a luncheon for the Lawyers Alliance for Nuclear Arms Control. Oh, that sounds interesting. The next thing I know more about nuclear weapons. You know, we actually went to Russia and negotiated. They stopped nuclear testing ahead of us. Kennedy wanted to stop testing, but they only let him stop it in the atmosphere and it went underground. We did another 1,000 of them. So then Russia, when Gorbachev came in and there was more openings, glasnost, and perestroika, you know, they were sort of giving more democracy to the people. There was a huge march in Kazakhstan at Semipalatinsk where the Russians tested. And the coal mines, and they wanted to stop testing because the underground tests leaked and the people were getting sick. And Gorbachev said, okay, he stopped. So my lawyers group went to Congress. We said, the Russians stopped. We have to stop. Oh, you can't trust the Russians. So the head of the Bar Association was very wealthy. He raised like $6 million. We hired a team of seismologists. We go over to Russia. We talked to them, will you let us put our seismologists around your test site? And Gorbachev said yes. And then we came back to Congress and we said, you don't have to trust the Russians. We have size, and we were able to stop nuclear testing. Anyway, I hope I answered your question. I think I went off. We really have to think about Russia. Because when I finally went over there and growing up as a child, I was terrified of communism. I mean, it was like, my God, somebody once gave me a pamphlet in 1954 during the McCarthy era at Queens College. It said Communist Party of America. My heart was pounding with fear. I go home, I go to the incinerator, I dump it down the chute without reading it. That's how scared you are to even hold something that said communism. And then with this lawyers group, I wind up in Russia when Gorbachev's in there. And they lost 27 million people to the Nazi onslaught. Does anybody hear that number? 27 billion. And I went to Leningrad. They had mass graves, mounds and mounds, 400,000 civilians from the siege of Leningrad. And every street corner had a monument to the dead. And every guy over 60 was walking around with his World War II medals on his chest. And we had a guide. He said to me, why don't you Americans trust us? I said, why don't we trust you? What about Hungary? What about Czechoslovakia? Why should we trust you? You know, and he looks at me with tears in his eyes. We had to protect our border from Germany. And I looked at him, and that was their truth. I mean, it was terrible what they did with the occupation of Eastern Europe, but they weren't coming after us. They were just sticking a buffer there to keep Germany out. And even Napoleon had invaded 100 years earlier. And Gorbachev, he let go of all of Eastern Europe. It was a miracle without a shot, right? And he was very nervous about a unified Germany going into NATO because of what Germany did to them. And Reagan promised him in the negotiations, let Germany be, don't worry, we promise you we won't expand NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, look where they are now, right up to their border doing nuclear games. There's a lot of responsibility in the West to make peace on this thing. They're open to it. They are definitely open to it.
Thank you. And I see many ways that this connects to what was brought forward so clearly in the film. And I think we'll come back to some of these discussions as well in the breakout rooms. Alice, when you next answer, I'll ask you just to speak very loudly and clearly, just because of the mic echo. I hope everyone is able to hear everything that you're saying. So there's a few sort of quick technical questions. One was, if you could please repeat the countries that the US keeps nuclear weapons in. And the second technical question was, where can we access the information on the total number of nuclear weapons, the number that you quoted?
The 5 NATO countries that host nuclear weapons on US bases in their country are Germany, Holland, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey. The actual numbers, their accounts, I think the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I could look it up, but just Google how many nuclear weapons are there on the planet, and there are scientific institutes that keep track of this, and they know the numbers, you know. So I can't give you the exact reference now.
There's a few questions on a similar theme related to how the TPNW may impact countries that are not signatory to it. So one of these questions sort of concerns countries that will say they didn't ratify the treaty and it doesn't bind to them. Will there be, you think, any impacts? And specifically, if you think there will be impacts on the US to stop the modernization of its arsenal.
Yes, I think we can use it if we're good and we speak well about it. It definitely worked, as I said earlier, with landmines, even though we never signed or signed the treaty of to ban landmines. The U.S. we don't make them anymore and we don't use them. They've become so taboo. And there's huge demonstrations now in Holland, Germany, Italy. Get the U.S. nukes out of NATO. I mean, that's gonna come back to us. You know, we're going to hear about it. There are parliamentary proposals in Italy and Germany and the Netherlands to get them out of NATO, or to change NATO's nuclear sharing policy, or to have NATO get rid of its nuclear policy. You know, there's a lot of pressure on the US coming from there, and hopefully we keep it up, you know. So I think it's going to happen, make a big difference, you know, because we're going to have a loud megaphone about this. And as far as the budget goes, I mean, Obama made a deal for $1 trillion over 20 years. He did this little negotiation with Medvedev, who was Putin's substitute president for a few years. And in order to get it through, where they were cutting 1,200 out of our 14,000 nuclear weapons, he made a deal with Congress that he would give them 2 new bomb factories in Kansas City and Los Alamos, new airplanes, submarines, missiles, and then Trump upped the budget. That's ridiculous. We need money to deal with the plague. We need money to deal with the global warming. We have to do windmills, solar power. I mean, we have to put huge numbers of people to work on the climate, on the land, that shift the agriculture, what's going on now. My daughter lives in Los Angeles. I told her to tear up her lawn and plant vegetables. I'll see if she listens to me. Anyway.
There's been a few comments sort of related to language, the way that truth is sort of either a casualty of war or just the language can obscure the truth. Someone pointed out that the idea of peaceful nuclear weapons is similar to the idea of clean coal or ethical oil or military intelligence. I wonder if you have anything you could share about sort of language around the TPNW and the treaty, and the ways nuclear weapons are framed as a strategy towards peace.
Right. Well, we have to really have a loud megaphone because the arms controllers, here we get this fabulous treaty. It's time to ban the bomb. They're illegal. They're prohibited. You can't use them. You can't rent it. And what are they asking for in America? Look at the peace, so-called peace. No first use. Make a pledge, no first use. Well, that's ridiculous. When a bank robber walks into a bank with a gun, you don't have to shoot it. You're using it just by threatening it. So to say that we're going to make all these laws to say we'll never be the first to use it when any president could just change that and say, I'm not buying that. That's ridiculous. We have to be talking about shutting things down, moratorium, using the money to meet human needs. I mean, we only used 2 nuclear bombs since 1945. What do we need? 14,000. What do we need new ones for? You know, I mean, we have to get our words and message out. It's very hard because, as President Eisenhower warned, there's the military-industrial complex, and the media is influenced by them. Congress is influenced. You know, it's very hard to get our message out. And I'll give you a really good example of this. Before the Iraq War, I was working with Code Pink. We had 1 million people in the streets of New York outside the UN saying no war in Iraq. The only television person that had us on, like Medea Benjamin and Helen Calder, was Phil Donahue, who had a talk show on MSNBC. It was the most popular, highly rated talk show. They fired him because he had people on the show saying, don't go to war in Iraq. So don't forget about the liberal media. There is no liberal mass media. They're liberal about abortion rights and gay rights, you know, wonderful. But when it comes to military, forget it. They're all in bed together. So we have our work cut out for us.
So we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions before we move to the breakout rooms. One is, do you have any specific tips for those who are asking their city council to come out and ban nuclear weapons?
This is great because in New York City a year ago, we had a hearing with 80 people, including survivors and native indigenous New Yorkers. And we got a resolution drafted with a supermajority, and the city council speaker, we've been standing on our head, he won't let it come to a vote. So certain cities, the ICANN campaign has model city resolutions. We're like tearing our hair out in New York City. It's like that power of politics, you know, like a speaker, you know, like O'Connell or Pelosi, you know, same thing in New York City Council. I've been calling my councilman, you know, he wants it. They can't get him to move. So. But do it, you know, go to your city, go to the state. There's national resolutions in Congress to calling on the government to support the ban treaty. Everybody should be talking to their member of Congress and telling them why this is important and why we need the money somewhere else. There's also a military budget cut caucus that's forming in the Congress among the progressives that say they want to cut at least 10%. Well, let it all come from nukes to begin with, you know.
Maybe as the Canada organizer with World Beyond War, it's a good moment for me to give a shout out to our Vancouver chapter that has been approaching and presenting and advocating at city councils in the Vancouver area, and just recently succeeded in getting the city of Langley, BC, to join the ICANN cities appeal and oppose all nukes. The city that I live in, Toronto, Canada's biggest city, has also joined the ICANN cities appeal. I played no part in that campaign, but I'm very proud to live in a city. So there is momentum around that, and I think it's a helpful thing for us to remember for those of us who live in countries where it feels like it will be very difficult to get our country to ratify the TPNW. Our cities may be more likely to do so, or to support it in analogous ways. I think there's time for just one more question, and then we'll move. I'll pass it back to my colleague Greta to lead us off into the breakout rooms. I see a question. Do you think there is any possibility that the treaty signatories might cease some sort of program against the nuclear countries? So following the example, for example, of boycott, divestment, sanction models.
Well, we're doing it at least in the banks. I mean, it's not directed to countries, but we are doing it with government pension funds. There's this Don't Bank on the Bomb.com website. It has every country, every manufacturer, you know, go there and figure out how you can work against industry there. That's, I don't know the other way, whether that would work, but it would work, you know, right against up against the countries, the corporations.
Are there other boycott or divestment campaigns related to nuclear weapons that you could point to?
No, that's like the big internet where, thank goodness, we're not split in 20 different ways, you know, like no first use, ban the bomb, and, you know, whatever. That seems to be the only thing, although there is a larger divestment campaign to divest from the military that Code Pink is doing, you know, which would include that.
Yeah, I can just chime in and say that we work on weapons divestment at World Beyond War as one of our key campaigns. And within each city, the context is slightly different. So for example, for a coalition that we're working on in Philly, the Divest Philly from the War Machine Coalition with many partner organizations, including Code Pink and Grannies, we've chosen to specifically focus on nuclear weapons, even though our broader focus is obviously to abolish war in its entirety, but that's our first step for that campaign. So I think on a city by city level, the campaign focus might be specifically on nuclear weapons in some cases. All right, with that, should we move to the breakout rooms? Okay, great. So we will open the rooms and then you'll get an invitation to join your room. Please click that button. And again, the rooms will be moderated by our World Beyond War chapter coordinators and staff members from around the world who will help to facilitate the conversation both about the movie, but also about January 22nd and how we can take action on this issue.